and the French would eventually push the Mohawks out. But it doesn't mean that this region wasn't contested. In fact, as the United States began moving westward, this region, the Chicago region, was highly contested. So there was so the tribes in the area had different ways of dealing with these. So the Potawatomi in particular saw themselves as not ever having to leave, but that they would be part of this new city, this new whatever this was going to be, that they wanted to be full participants in it. What that meant to the United States Congress, though, is that the Potawatomi were not going to leave their land. The Congress had already pushed the Ho-Chunk out. The Sauk were still in the area and refusing to leave, Meskwaki as well. And when we get to about 1832 with the Black Hawk War, this is when the Sauk not just go into conflict with the United States, but also lose their spot on the map. The Sauk get their name specifically from the Los fields and the Los areas in the region. It means yellow earth people. That yellow earth, if you go into the Kettle Moraine, all these areas, that's where you see that yellow earth. So this is the place where they originate from. But why we don't talk about them is because after the Black Hawk War, Black Hawk loses. As a result, the Sauk and Meskwaki get sort of erased from the region's history. Why do we talk about the Potawatomi, though? Well, the Potawatomi thought, and along with the Ho-Chunk, felt that in order for them to keep whatever land they could, they sided with the United States, and it was actually two Army volunteer units of Potawatomis and Ho-Chunks that would capture Black Hawk at Koshkonong Swamp in southern Wisconsin. With that said, all 80 Potawatomi villages in northeast Illinois thought they were fine. They would later find a year later, on September 26th, that they would lose all of this. Now, Chevalier's village in particular was important. One, you can see all the river routes here, but again, you have coming in, they need water to irrigate, so the swampland becomes important. Chevalier himself was interesting. He was one of the more prominent Potawatomi chiefs, and he took the name Chevalier. I believe it was a family friend, but it was also to kind of show his allegiance to the French as well. So even though he was dealing with the United States, he wanted to kind of make clear that they still remembered those allegiances with the French, but also that he was Catholic. And what's interesting about the Potawatomi from St. Joseph River all the way to the Calumet is they're largely Roman Catholic. And so Chevalier's daughter, for example, Katish, so names like Katish and Katala are Potawatomi from the Catherine. So if you were a young lady, Catholic in Potawatomi, your name would either be Katish or Moni or Marie. Jean would be if you were a man. So you have a lot of Catholic Potawatomis in this area, and Katish's husband, another chief, was an Odawa man named Alexander Robinson, or Chipping-Winowan, the Blinking Eye. When he married Chevalier's daughter, he actually got his own reservation up on the Des Plaines and would become one of the treaty negotiators for the Potawatomi. And something that's interesting is all the negotiators were Odawa. So even though you had large Potawatomi villages, you had a lot of Odawa and Menominee chiefs and Miami chiefs as well, especially in the St. Joseph River area. You had like Topash and Weesaw, who are two of probably the last remaining Miami chiefs, but also the Miami chiefs who refused to leave. So 1833, you have removal. Typical Chicago history says all the Indians were gone by 1837. That's not quite the case. The Calumet region, northwest Indiana to St. Joseph, was claimed by the Pokagon Potawatomi. And Pokagon never signed the 1833 treaty, thus he felt that none of his band's territory should be given to the United States. The next 20 years, you have a series of legal battles. At some point, there was a final removal of the Potawatomi out of Indiana, which is the Potawatomi Trail of Death, which moves them out of the South Bend area into eventually Kansas and then Oklahoma. But there was a lot of folks that stayed. One thing about the Pokagon band in particular is they found various ways to stay, and one of that was being Catholic. As the United States and the settlers were coming in, the view that if an Indian was Catholic, they were quote unquote civilized. Thus, they were able to remain in an area because they weren't a renegade Indian. What a lot of these people didn't know was a lot of the Catholic Potawatomi still spoke their language, and up in to about 1950, there was still a large Potawatomi community in what's now Harwood Heights and Norridge and Schiller Park. A lot of them had stayed on Robinson Reserve. So that's one of the things is the Potawatomi leave. Miami also did not leave as well. So when we're thinking about the origins of Calumet City too, a lot of Miami and Potawatomi folks were still very much present and active in that city building process. So folks that survived, and this is sort of a precursor to some of the exhibits that we're doing at the Field Museum that will be opening next year. Agnes Topash, who is, but she was a married Pokagon Potawatomi, took this picture in 1909, and this is a lot of the yearly gatherings that in Northwest Indiana, Northern Indiana, Chicago region would come to and gather. These were largely Pokagon Potawatomis, Miami, Ape. People would come from Kansas, Oklahoma to these gatherings, and there was always a continued presence. We jump to about 1968. This is the canoe club that operated out of the American Indian Center. And two of its founders, so right here is Leroy Weesaw Sr., and this is Ralph Rees, if you know, he's a prominent canoe enthusiast. These canoes are all fiberglass, and they were created by Ralph Rees, Leroy Weesaw, and the two guys escaping me, but basically, how do you get a birch bark to this canoe club in particular? What they did is they visited all the old waterways, so the Calumet River, the Little Plains. They would frequently paddle from Chicago to Dubai, and it would be sort of a weekend excursion. So paddled up to Green Bay and Mackinac Island, and in a row actually circumnavigated Lake Michigan, starting in Chicago, ending in Chicago. So pretty prominent club, and part of it was to get not just Potawatomi and Miami and local tribes interested in the landscape and the history, but also maintaining a physical and visible presence by being on the water and letting Chicago, Calumet City, Hammond, Maryville, all these places kind of know that Native folks are still around. And thanks to the last picture, so recently, Tribe Oklahoma and Pokagons have been, and Kimberly Swift, I know she's on this call as well, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that they're working with the National Park Service at Miller Creek on wild rice restoration in the region. So tribes that have been still active, and Ho-Chunks are still here. They're still, they're actually buying up backland, and something that tribes that had been removed are doing now is, as These are doing really well. They're buying back land in former territories. So I believe the Ho-Chunk own about 8 acres in the Chicago region. Prairie Band Potawatomi own New Shibona Township is 150 acres, and they actually purchased that village site back. Um, but along with Potawatomis and Ho-Chunks, there's a large number of Sauk coming from Oklahoma and buying back land in Illinois area, Western Illinois, and looking also at Northeast Illinois as well. So I'm going to end it right there, and I guess we can go into some questions. And
Okay, it's Mary. Yeah, there's a question from Cynthia Ogoric. Oh, it says, could you please elaborate on the history of Calumet City that you mentioned?
yeah, so Calumet City is built, as you can see on the map, it was fairly swampy, but it's built on 3 fairly large village sites that originally built by the Iowa tribe and then occupied by Miami and Potawatomi. So the basic, and these are the high ground areas. So these become the template as swamps are drained and a little bit more work is done. Essentially, Calumet City sort of grows out of that area, but underneath are those 3 large village sites, along with the about 10 smaller villages. And at some point, there used to be large mound clusters that had been over uh, in the construction. So a lot of cemeteries had also been destroyed as the city was being created. Swamps were being drained.
Is there another question? Okay, from Sue B. Could you please talk more about native use of buyback land, residence, material harvest?
All right, so land buyback is something that began about 20 years ago. And I believe like Ho-Chunk were one of the first tribes to do this, and with their casino revenues, same with the Prairie Band Potawatomi as well. They actually have divisions in their land management offices to purchase back land from former territories. And so what you have, in some cases, it's whole communities. So like New Lenox, Illinois, for example, is actually owned by the Ho-Chunk in Wisconsin. New Shibona Township was an interesting case. So Shibona was a Potawatomi chief. He was actually Odawa chief of a Potawatomi band. He had been working with Arthur Bronson, who is the guy, he was the land speculator who came in, um, who started buying land for the United States and for the Michigan territory in particular. Shibona worked with him, and when Shibona signed over his land, uh, basically an illegal signature. So the Prairie Band Potawatomi, of which he was essentially they're one of the descendants of his village, had the money, and they actually bought back the 150 acres that comprised of Shibona's original reservation. And that's something too to remember. Chevalier's village, starts as a village in sites, and it eventually becomes a reservation in 1828. So when we think about like Calumet City, for example, and parts of Chicago, they were actually Indian reservations. They would then become incorporated into the city as a whole. But land buybacks, generally, tribes are doing them in small areas. Sometimes it is areas where there are particular resources. As far as, I guess, the legal means to reclaim land, one thing about the United States is private property is king. So a lot of tribes, and even during the removal period, found that if they did not sign the treaties, they would get fee simple, or they would get a deed to their land. And sort of using U.S. real estate and private property laws is actually how a lot of tribes either retain land or buy back land. And then what they'll do is they'll put that land into a tribal trust. So now it's trust land, and the state or the feds cannot touch it after that. But it's not as negative as, like, for example, there are good relationships in some cases, like the Shinnecox in Long Island. When they bought back a large portion of Long Island, the residents were fearful. They thought they were going to get removed, all this stuff. What the Shinnecox did is they dropped the property taxes down like 2.5%, which then everybody was very happy to live. So that's usually what happens is property taxes go down, and then the tribe creates revenue from that. So they'll either have businesses or collect. It's usually for tribal enterprises to do these things.
Other question now? Larry McClellan asked how the study of native groups in our area has evolved since the early 20th century.
I think it's evolved greatly. That's where I kind of started with those sort of Indian Claims Commission maps up until 1968. The general idea is that this was all Potawatomi land, and and that was it. There were no other tribes, and nobody existed before 1492. So I think what has evolved, and this is also largely the part of tribal historic preservation offices and tribal historians, is working with archaeologists and going back in oral history to find these village sites. And people like Albert Sharp, for example, his map is tremendous in that he got mound groups, he got old villages, new villages as of 1804. So a lot of the cartographers in the regions did actually take a lot of good data, but when you think about removal, if you acknowledge that people had been before, it's a little hard to remove. Case, for example, the Miami, part of their removal, their graves and cemeteries were actually looted and removed to remove any physical presence that they were even there. So there was a bit of an erasure from history. Potawatomi, like I said, they kind of escaped that because they did side with the United States against Black Hawk. And so that was kind of the reward. What that did, however, was create some animosities with the Sauk and the Meskwaki, because they felt that the Potawatomi had no right to even give away that land. And these are things that are discussed, but as I think tribal stories and also tribal owners start doing this history and digging and looking at oral histories, looking at diaries, looking at maps, a lot of this starts coming together. But I also think since about the early 60s, historians have kind of changed slightly. There was a lot more, I know a lot of archaeologists were working with tribes more often than had been in the past. And the Indian Claims Commission was kind of an interesting thing because it gave tribes the right to talk about the story to their signing of their treaties or things like that. So it's evolving. I think it's getting there. It's interesting with land acknowledgements now that a lot of organizations are doing these land acknowledgements, but it also means you have to do deeper research. So these things are also kind of forcing people to do this. But also, I just think it's just the evolution of the history and also local history. People are kind of interested in who lived here, who lived where my house is. I know with the Sharp maps we used to at Mace, we would overlay the a contemporary Chicago map over that, and I'm really interested on what was living. have become pretty interested in that local history. And I'd say in the last 30 years, there's been a larger interest in Native history in the region. And it seems to be moving more and more and getting deeper. And I know, it's as people ask and as people are curious, this helps.
A couple of people have suggested that we all mute ourselves so that we can hear Eli better before I go on to the next question, if you all want to do that. Craig asks if you have a map showing villages in Lake County, Indiana. You mentioned Merrillville and others in Porter and Lake in LaPorte counties.
I have not found specific maps of that region. I know they are, I'm trying to think, it would be, I know the Chicago History Museum have quite a few maps, but I would say a source to look for those would be the Library of Congress and National Archives. I believe their Great Lakes office or Great Lakes Station should have those maps of the regions. A lot of them are going to be military maps and commerce maps. And usually the military maps I find tend to be better because they will have village sites, they will have roads, and they tend to be a little bit detailed.
Okay, Linda Weed asks if is there any move to use legal means to reclaim the land?
There was a case by the Miami in Illinois. There were 4 counties that were occupied by the state of Illinois in 1818, but Congress had not approved the state to take those lands. So there was a legal challenge for the Miami tribe to reclaim those lands. But it did not turn out too well for them. It's just a matter of their lawyer was not the best lawyer for these kinds of things. But it was a case where the state actually claimed the land before Congress gave them permission to do this. And this happens quite a bit. A lot of states often would just take and then without congressional approval. I don't know the status of that particular case, but had they won, the Miami tribe would have, and it wouldn't have been reservation land either. It would have been basically it would have been similar to the Muskogee case in that the land was never legally transferred to the state. So they almost had it, but it did bring up for other tribes to how to go about reclaiming land, and that's why land buyback tends to be the easiest route because it's less time in the court and you can just buy the land outright. Some people feel they shouldn't have to buy back their land, but in terms of what's quickest and easiest, that tends to be the easier route.
Cynthia Ogoric asked if you could talk about any specific sites in Calumet City.
I think, so we go back. Just a second. Back here. So there's this village number 13 in particular. This was Chevalier's primary village in between Calumet and Wolf Lake. This is probably where the majority of people lived at that time, and it stretches also, it kind of goes off the map, so it stretches into Indiana as well, basically all of Wolf Lake. But 13 is basically where most of the people lived. Village 11 and Village 12, sort of like the outskirts of his primary area. I know 11 in particular had was more tribally diverse than 13. 13 was predominantly Potawatomi. And I believe, and as far as the mounds and sort of the mound sites, those we aren't really talked about because they are, even though a lot of them have been destroyed, they're still considered sacred. And so any information about that is generally not shared. Um, but this particular area by Village 13 is kind of what everybody was fighting for. Uh, as you can see, you've got great water access, you have resources. It's one of the better sites, I would say.
Okay, Valerie Penniman asks, to what extent have native languages and traditional customs survived among the peoples of this region?
It survived actually pretty well. Um, as I said, a lot of the Catholic Potawatomi still spoke their language. Um, and, for the most part, they lived in, I don't want to say isolated communities, but because they were able, so those who didn't sign the 1833 Treaty of Chicago were able to stay on their land, they generally formed fairly tight-knit communities. Um, so people were able to keep customs. Eventually, by about the 1920s, however, it does begin to change. Some traditions start fading. And I know in the case of the Pokagons, by about the 1960s, fluent speakers were down a bit, but what kind of pulled them together were ash basket making. And so with the revival of black ash baskets for the Pokagons, it helped regain their sovereignty because it united people. But also, it involved related folks from Little Traverse, Bay Odawa families came down. Uh, so there was a period where people were losing some of those traditions in some ways to assimilate because I think, if you were trying to get a job and if you said you were Indian, you were lower than blacks, uh, and literally at the bottom. So a lot of times people didn't say they were Indian. Passing, something that was commonly done if people were mixed enough that they could pass as white. Um, do that. So it's kind of a bit complex. And then others, there was a big fight between the Catholic and traditional Potawatomis as well as, who's more Potawatomi and whatnot. I think in some ways the Pokagons, because they wanted to maintain their presence on their land, despite being Catholic, actually maintained a lot of traditions. And even today, there's a lot of traditions that still exist, like making birch bark canoes, making elm bark canoes, things that people were stopping. Uh, but also because they stayed, they never left their traditional territory. When the Potawatomi who did have to go to Kansas and Oklahoma had to readapt to new environments. And Robin Kimmerer talks about Citizen Band in Oklahoma, where one of the things that men did was fish, and bringing home fish was something young men would do. Being in the middle of Oklahoma, that was not possible. So pecan picking became the new fish. So, they had to readapt, whereas like the Pokagons, Gun Lake, Huron bands were able to maintain an identity in connection with the land. Um, but also with that too, I should mention that there's a lot of Potawatomi from Oklahoma returning to Chicago, returning to Northwest Indiana. Um, and they're just coming regardless of whether there's land buybacks or not. And so they're also bringing back some of those traditions that were brought down to Oklahoma and Kansas as well. Uh, and working with Gun Lake tribe has been interesting because you have not just Gun Lake, but Pokagon and Citizen and Forest County Potawatomi folks living there. So there's a real pooling of knowledge. And sometimes people will think things are lost, but they in fact have remained. And a lot of it's families. it's not really a tribe as a whole, but you have families who know certain traditions. It's like the black ash basket making. That was 3 families that still have that tradition, and now it's pretty widespread. Of course, with emerald ash borer, finding the trees is a little harder now. Um, but this is where that oral history and family histories come in, and I guess that question of how has Native history in this region changed as far as it being told, I think maybe that emphasis on oral histories and family histories also pushing that. People have places differently. Um, so yeah, I think, you know, we should never assume traditions are lost and languages are lost. I know Alexander Robinson, who died in 1872, one was able to watch the city of Chicago burn, but he still spoke Potawatomi, Odawa, and French till the day he died. And his children were fluent in Potawatomi, French, and English. And I think his great grandson, Frank Petcher, who passed away in, I believe, 1975, was still fluent in the language. So that is something that I think has stayed, is the language. And through that language, other traditions that may have been lost are now able to be revived. And also, too, the Potawatomi, which are in about 5 different bands right now, have been working together since the 1980s and sort of consolidating. So 5 separate bands tend to act as one nowadays. So I hope that helps.
From Sophie Rodriguez, is this buyback part of the Cobell versus Salazar settlement?
No, Cobell is a completely different thing. Cobell is mostly west of the Mississippi, uh, but it is related to uh, treaty territories.
Mark Bowman says that there are a few interesting Northwest Indiana maps as part of the Calumet Voices National Stories exhibit here. If you scroll down in the chat section, you'll see a link. And I think
how you doing? Hey, how you doing?
Hey Blake, how you doing?
Okay, I want to find out about the Kickapoo and the Sac tribes. Have they lived in the Calumet region somehow?
Yeah, so the Sauk actually, as one of their points of origin, is in the Calumet all the way through the southern Wisconsin. And the Kickapoo actually come out of the Miami tribe. So when the Miami settle in the Chicago region, Calumet area, the Kickapoo actually break off and go south. So they lived, when they lived here, they were mostly under the Miami, and I believe about 18, probably about the 1810s or so, they break off and move into southern Illinois. And that was basically to get away from settlers. As far as they were concerned, the Kickapoo, well, so most of the Miami wanted to stay in the region. The Kickapoo saw that they were going to get pushed out anyway, so they moved south, and they would eventually relocate themselves to Kansas and Oklahoma. And one group actually went to Mexico. So the Mexican governor of Mexico basically allowed them a site to settle as long as they kept Indians out of Mexico. So they were basically sort of shock troops for the Mexican government to keep the Apache and Navajo and Comanche from crossing the border. So there was also a group of Potawatomi that still live in northern Mexico. And what's interesting about the Potawatomi and Kickapoo living in Mexico is that they do not speak Spanish. They speak Potawatomi and Kickapoo, some French, and some English. But for the most part, as part of the agreement, they never had to assimilate into the state of Mexico, and
And
that they would remain on that border. But what they also did, like, and of interest to you, is they brought a lot of the crops, such as the white corn, a lot of the Labacones pumpkins from the Midwest to northern Mexico as well. And that's something that is, that Miami did develop species of white corn, which becomes the ancestor of the sweet corn that we all eat today. And that white corn was traded from the Chicago region all the way down to the Southwest. So it was a high, pretty high commodity, because it was one of the few corns that you could actually eat off the cob, and it had a natural sweetness to it. Most corn, especially the flint corns, tend to be hard. They're more for grinding, and they're not very sweet. So that was something that they did bring into northern Mexico, and that they still grow to this day.
I've seen you before, Eli. So how's your garden doing, including your Miami corn and stuff? Try to find some corn from the Illinois and Miami tribes at the field.
Well, and what Blake is talking about, so we have the rice gardens at the Field Museum, and it is a naturalized landscape on a completely man-made peninsula. The garden's doing very well. We had 4 pawpaw fruit that we were able to get this year. So the wildlife is loving the garden, and it's looking really good.
We've seen each other before. When will we meet again on whether it's Zoom or live on stuff about the Calumet region? I was talking to the guy that I met before. I'm in a meeting online. That was my dad. I was talking about when we meet again on Zoom on the Calumet region. I just want to learn more about the crops from every Native American that's found in the Calumet area, including the Potawatomi, Illinois, Miami, Ho Chunk, and others.
So I can tell you the Pokagons have been creating a seed bank of traditional crops. The Ho Chunk also, which also run a farm, which I believe you can buy some produce from there. They have been cataloging the seeds and keeping a lot of the old varieties. The Meskwaki and Tama, Iowa still have their old crops. And interesting to note, with the derecho that went through, I'm sure Calumet region got really hit by that, or if it did. What was interesting is the old varieties of corn actually withstood the derecho and actually are almost tornado proof. They can back up nicely, and they had a good harvest. But a lot of those, when we think about it, it's good to bring up food.
There's my face. We meet again.
We meet again. Yep. So a lot of those crops, and thinking about like what people were eating in the Calumet, a lot of those crops are still in existence today. They're still accessible. And actually at the Field Museum, we are working on a project on a couple of those varieties of beans and corn, but we're also looking at other tribes that we're finding more stuff in the collection. So I guess as we work on that, we'll have more to report on.
For corn from the Illinois Confederation and more from the Miami tribe, if you all have some.
All right. Next question.
My question is, I'm looking for more corn from the Illinois Confederation, as well as from Miami, and from the Field Museum.
So real quick, if anyone is interested in buying heirloom seed varieties, I would suggest contacting the tribes directly, and they can point you in the right direction. I know a couple of the tribes do have seeds that are available. And there was a question by Mark Coleman about the Native North America Hall. So slated for next year, probably around November, December, we'll be reopening the Native North America Hall, fully renovated. And what will be new to the hall is there's a particular story gallery dedicated to the Chicago region. So that will include everything from northeastern Illinois, northwest Indiana, and southern Wisconsin. That'll be opening soon, probably about, like I said, November, and we will be trying to focus on local stories. So, and bringing in tribes from the region as well to tell their stories, and should be interesting. And our opening exhibit for the Chicago Gallery will be Chicago as a Place of Gathering. So we will touch on some of the topics that we talked about tonight in a little detail. And yeah, I guess.
Can I share seats with you sometime one day in the near future? I've got some native stuff, especially from the tribes of the Calumet area.
Yep, I think when we can go back to the museum and everything kind of clears out, I'm sure we can get back. We can do that.
I'm looking for some more stuff from the Miami and Potawatomi tribes besides the ones that I have. I'm looking for the Waffle Island white flour corn from the Potawatomi, which I need more of.
Okay, Mary? Any more questions? Mary? Sorry, I was muted. It doesn't look like there are any questions.
I have another question. I was wondering if the whole chunk lived in the Calumet area besides the Potawatomi, Illinois.
Yep, Ho-Chunk lived in the Calumet region. And probably one of the oldest, anywhere, I believe, 6,000 to 8,000 years in the region.
And I know they had problems with the Illinois Confederation and some of their other kin, including the Miami.
Yep, there were conflicts. For the most part, the Ho-Chunk do have in their oral history talk about when a lot of the tribes came into the region. So they weren't always like negative. A lot of times they were fairly peaceful because they were aware that a lot of these folks were pushed out from the east. So they're actually pretty accommodating. So like those 3 large villages in Chevalier, which would become Chevalier's villages, actually welcomed in quite a few folks with a few tribes, families. So they were pretty, so while there were conflicts, there was also a lot of hospitality that happened as well.
Eli, we just got a question from Barbara Dust who asks, is there a resource you could recommend for crafting a land acknowledgement?
Yeah, there's actually a website that I can, if I send it to you, Michael, could you send that out?
Yes.
Cool.
Here's my red corn of the Miami tribe. It's a Miami white flour corn.
Cool.
All right.
Cool.
So, Mary, are there any more questions? It doesn't look like it. Everybody is very pleased and they're saying thank you. It's been an excellent presentation.
Yep. And I'll send some of the resources and maps to Michael, and then he can send that out to the broader.
Yeah. And Barb, can you remind me? I'll try to remember. So anyway, thank you very much, Eli. Thank you very much. And I just want to mention that our next Calumet Revisited will be on Tuesday, December 1st by way of Zoom. And that will be Gloria Orozco. She's the field organizer for the Calumet region for the Friends of the Forest Preserve. And she'll be speaking on volunteer opportunities at 3 sites: Whistler Woods, Bobian Woods, and Kickapoo Woods. And that will be on Tuesday, December 8th at 5 p.m. So if there's no other questions, I appreciate everybody coming out, and we've had a good crowd. And next time, perhaps I'll get some of the technical problems solved before we get too far into it.
I'll tell Yadi hello for you, Eli.
So thank you very much for attending, and we'll see you next month then.
All right, thank you, everyone.
Adios.